All right, so I know I'm a little late to the party, but there's a lot to cover on this album, so, well, let's just dive into it. Omnium Gatherum by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. So, if you guys don't know about King Giz, they are an Australian rock band who really at this point kind of defy genre. I mean, they started off as being like this garage rock band, but then started to really dip their toes into all these different musical styles, everything ranging from psychedelic prog all the way to very pastel urban jazz, even into like fully formed like concept albums expressed in a thrash metal band. They like to play a lot with microtones. They've put out 3 albums specifically with that. And they just never really sit still. And their output is staggering. Like, these are the guys that essentially put out like 5 albums in 1 year back in 2017, I think it is. So here we are now with Omnium Gatherum. And this one's coming off of the heels of the 2-record suite of their the KGLW, which is their continuation of the whole Microtonos one, and they also put out the Butterfly 3000, which was a little bit more on the pastel rock, very like hippie, very 70s influenced in that sense. When they were promoting this, they put out the two singles from this album, the Gargantuan, the Gargantuan Dripping Tap. Boy, I have to be careful with that one. I love this. This is 18 minutes of just an amazing jam session. Taking influences from prog, taking influences from that garage rock style, and I love how these 18 minutes really just float away. So it almost feels as though you've listened to 4 minutes. I love the first real theme of this, and I love how it ties itself back together, where you're introduced to the big kind of main chorus of this, and then they go off for like a good 15 minutes to bring it back around again. It's something that a lot of the 70s prog bands were doing, and these guys were able to recapture that spirit very, very well. And the second track being Magenta Mountain. And again, it just surprised me. Even though this one's just over 6 minutes, the time flies and it almost feels as though it's 3. And they're using such great sounds from the synthesizer that like a John Anderson would use off of his first couple of solo records, especially I always call it the Shadow of Sun Hollow, but I think it's like the Oasis of Sun Hollow. Anyway, that brilliant record from John Anderson. It's like mimicking those same kind of synth sounds. These 2 tracks got me just salivating for more. And I was so excited and so ready for this. And when I actually got into the album proper, I don't want to say I was disappointed, but like there's so much on here. And there's really no real consistency, even though most of the tracks do bleed into each other very seamlessly. Because they're jumping around in style, it does provide on the first handful of listens a little bit of a disjointed essence. Especially when I was, so familiar with the first 2 tracks of the Dripping Tap and Magenta Mountain. By the time we got into Kepler 22b, I was a little I was a bit blindsided in that sense of, oh, this is interesting, because this is one of like 3 tracks that are a little bit more, shall I say, like urban jazz in that case, like a hip hop almost. Kepler 22b is one of the first ones to kind of dip their toe into more of this like an urban jazz, some very similar to what they were doing with the sketches from East Brunswick. And I'm going to actually fly around in terms of the order of tracks in here, because I want to group like tracks with like tracks. So another one is the Sadie's Sorceress, as well as the Grim Reaper. And these 2 tracks, again, have that same kind of this hip-hop feel, almost like early Beastie Boys in that case. Like I can see them having this fun kind of taste with these 2 tracks. It's very hip-hop-ish, very like beat and rhythm in that case. This is their first real foray into that, like almost touching on rap. And in some cases it's fun, it's different, but I'm not quite sure if this was really the place for that. After Kepler 22b, we come into one of two extremely heavy tracks, and that is Gaia, the other one being Predator X. And both of these tracks could have fit very well with their thrash metal album of Infest the Rat's Nest, where it's so bombastic, it's so heavy, it's thrashy, it's got this really aggressive time signature, time rhythm in that case, and the guitars are very chugging, it's very like dun 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 dun. So it's very, again, rhythmic in that case, and the singing styles very mimic the singing styles that we had from Infest the Rat's Nest, where, again, very aggressive, very metal, very, like, raw metal, that very, like, thrash metal in that case. Having it follow up Kepler 22b, again, it blindsides you a little bit. Like, this album never really wants you to get comfortable, because the moment that you're starting to get into the groove, they sidestep it entirely and try something completely different. As much as I do love both Gaia and Predator X, they feel a little bit out of place, very similar to how Sadie, Sorceress, and the Grim Reaper feel a little bit out of place. Now, from there, you get some of these more trippy, more ambient, more chill tracks. And that is what you get from, we've already mentioned Magenta Mountain, but the Ambergris, as well as Presumptuous. And these tracks are more of the highlight. Like, this was more of the music that I was really looking forward to and really wanting to dive into off of this record with the two singles that were kind of leading us into it. And I just love how smooth these tracks are. Like, Ambergris is just this, it's some of the better parts that we had from like Butterfly 3000. It's very minstrel. It's essentially just the acoustic guitar, a little bit of the piano works on there, very minimalistic in that case. And it's just very chill. It's very like, all things are all right. But the other track that I haven't really talked about was Evilest Man, the second longest track at 7.5 minutes. And this is one of my favorite tracks off this album. Again, this is what I was really, really hoping for the album overall in terms of the style, the structure, the sounds. Very trippy, very proggy in this case, very 70s. It's very smooth. It's very jivey. I love the soundscapes on here. The other tracks I haven't touched upon, they kind of have these like 3-track suites that have a singular run. With most of these run times, even though the tracks do flow into one another, it's a very clear division between the tracks, mainly just because of the track styles. Like Kepler 22b and Gaia, very, very different. Gaia and Ambergris, very, very different. Ambergris and Sadie Sorceress, very, very different. But it isn't until we get to Goblin Garden, Blame It on the Weather, and Persistence that these 3 tracks are very similar. And unless you're looking at the runtime, you wouldn't realize that you went from one passage to another. It really holds the flow extremely well. And if they had more of these types of tracks off of this album, I would have been extremely excited to continuously come back to it and really, really get into it. The same can be said about the last 3 tracks. After Predator X, you have Red Smoke, Candles, and Funeral. These 3 tracks do that same thing where it really blends one into the other, where you have about like 9 to 10 minutes of uninterrupted flow of music. Which I just really, really enjoy. The only other track that I haven't really touched upon is Presumptuous. Again, love this track, and it's interesting because I feel like Persistence, being the last of the Garden Goblin, Blame It on the Weather, and Persistence, it's very similar and almost a mirror image to the Presumptuous. And right smack in the middle, you have the Grim Reaper, which again, it's that Beastie Boys kind of a hip-hop expression of music. So it's a very interesting kind of a blending of tracks in that case. And Presumptuous is very similar to the Evilest Man in being this very trippy, proggy, shorter piece of music in this one, being almost about 5 minutes long, but I'm just loving the groove. I'm loving the styles of this one. Yeah, that's the album overall, it ends with that last 3, Red Smoke, Candles, and Funeral. I do wish that the Funeral was probably about another 2 or 3 minutes long to play out the album. I do feel as though this album was cut out by the knees because it didn't really feel like an ending. It just felt like a ellipses. Like it felt like a ... Especially with the runtime that we had behind it, I was really looking forward to something big, something epic to finish this album off, or even like this really fun play out. What I will say overall about this album, it is definitely a mixed grab bag in terms of style. On the one hand, it is definitely all over the place. It changes from track to track to track. It still has a relatively familiar groove to it. Each of these tracks have, to one extent or another, been explored on other albums, but I do feel as though they've been more perfected on this one. And it's just a shame that there's these like really fully realized tracks in this massive superstore of all these other tracks that aren't really connected in any way, shape, or form. This is a really good example of a road trip album, in that you can put it on and please pretty much everybody in the car. I'm not quite sure if I would have appreciated if they were to take about like 40 minutes of this music that was very similar, like The Dripping Tap, like Ambergris, like The Evilest Man, like Presumptuous, and just kind of put it on its own album and included more of the same, and then had this other disc that's much more of like Gumboot Soup, the final album of their Big 5 album release back in 2017, where it really was just throwing anything at the wall and seeing what stuck. So yeah, this one's a little bit interesting for me to rate, because there is an album, like about a 40-minute, maybe even a 45-minute album in here that I absolutely love with my whole heart, but because there's so much ebb and flow and strangeness on here, it does compromise the listen just a bit for me. So yeah, in the end, I will say that Omnium Gatherum by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard is one that I would still probably download. You know, it's still far and away from their worst album, and it probably has some of their best music that's on it, but again, the variety and sheer randomness of this album, it reminds me of the White Album from the Beatles, you know, where it's just so all over the place, and in some respects it works, but in other respects it does create a very disjointed listen. There you go. What did you guys think of Omnium Gatherum from King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Have a listen to it and let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.